Welcome to the Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemix. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Hey there, welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked the what-if questions to better understand the world and learn how data can help tell stories that impact the decisions to create an intentional impact of the future. This is your host, John Cordier. Today, we're on with Paolo Gaudiano. Paolo, great to have you on.
John, it's a real pleasure to be on. I've been following your work for a while and I've been very eager to talk to you. So this is quite an exciting opportunity. Thank you.
Of course. So you've had a lot going on as of late. Why don't you tell some of the listeners a little bit about current work that you're working on, and we'll start there.
The majority of the work that I've been doing these days is focused on a field that right now is not seen too favorably, and that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And which I know most people, when they hear that, they're like, oh, condolences. This is not a great time to be doing that. I've actually gotten into diversity, equity, and inclusion about 10 years ago. And my angle is unique in that actually it was born out of a more than familiarity, doing more than 2 decades of work in complexity science, applied complexity science in a variety of flavors. Mm-hmm. And about 10 years ago, I saw this opportunity to try to use the background and all the experience that I had to see if I could quantify the financial benefit for organizations to be more diverse and more inclusive. And I felt that a lot of the work that I'd seen in DI focused more on fairness, justice, equality and things of that sort, or equity. And also when it came to quantitative, the best that people seem to be able to do is to talk about very broad correlations, which of course are, there's the old correlation versus causation issue. And I felt that what was really needed was something that would be able to tell individual organizations or individual leaders of organizations how changing the way that their organization treats its employees would actually lead to improvements in their financial KPIs. So sure. I set out to do that about 10 years ago, and I do two things. I have Valeria, which is a for-profit, mission-driven for-profit that right now is focusing mostly on measuring inclusion, and I can get into that later. And then I also have a nonprofit that does more of the core research using agent-based simulation or agent-based modeling and applying that to a variety of problems, primarily business, but also other aspects of society.
Sure. So a lot of the people that have joined our podcast, they've been in complexity science for a while. They've been in agent-based modeling for a while. But you're the first person to make the jump from complexity science and ABM into diversity, equity, and inclusion. What was one of your kind of aha moments that there's, things that we can take from agent-based modeling from like a way to understand, but then also the complexity science to move from what a lot of people might be doing in economics or epidemiology or other things that might be more viewed as like a harder science than DEI. So what was your moment where you're like, there's something here, got to do something with it?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think it's worth mentioning that I started doing agent-based modeling before I knew that it was agent-based modeling. And that's when I was doing my PhD. I was actually, even before my PhD, I was doing neural networks. I started to work on neural networks. I learned about the brain from an engineering perspective at the end of my undergraduate back in 1984. That's how old I am. And so I decided to do a master's, and I had an opportunity to work with a person in the aerospace department at CU Boulder who was doing neural networks. And so I started to build neural network models. And then I ended up doing my PhD at Boston University with Steve Grossberg group. And one of the things that characterized that work was that we were really looking at simulating individual neural circuits. So for example, half of my PhD thesis was on studying how the retina can do this amazing feat of translating light signals into nervous signals that the rest of the brain can interpret. And then the other half was about sensory motor control. How can humans and animals learn to control, let's say, arm movements or eye movements without any kind of supervision? And so I was literally building simulations of individual neurons interacting and then seeing emergent phenomena such as being able to recognize an object or being able to move a robot through a space. And then in 1991, when I became a professor, I had the opportunity. I ended up meeting Eric Bonobo, Many of your listeners may have heard about Eric. And
Yep.
then what happened is that we became friends. We started to kind of compare notes, and I really appreciated his work, and he appreciated some of mine. And then later on in the year 2000, when I left, I decided to leave academia. I was a professor for 10 years, building all kinds of agent-based models, which I didn't call them that. But we sort of crossed paths again, and he had just started an ecosystem, and he was just in the process of moving it to Cambridge, Mass, and I was in the Boston area, so it worked out like a dream, and we started to work. And so for me, when I got into agent-based models, which was 25 years ago, it was immediately like love at first sight because I understood all the concepts, I knew how to build the simulations, but it was the first time that I was able to see how to apply to a bunch of different problem areas. And along the way, we did a lot of work on consumer insights, and some of the work was actually in personnel management. So fast forward 2015, Eric and I have been getting kind of tired of because we were doing R&D and consulting, but we were not as successful at creating startups as we wanted to. We'd done a couple that were like spin-offs, but it got to the point where we were getting a little bit tired of constantly chasing after the next big consulting project and then trying to turn it into something more exciting.
Yep.
And so we were deciding what to do, and I was listening to a session. I was personally interested in DI. I'd always been intrigued by racial inequalities, gender inequalities, just for personal reasons. But I never really thought, I'm a white dude. What can I do? And then one day, as I was sitting there listening to the umpteenth session on, how do you get more women into leadership? How do you get more Black people into marketing? Whatever the case might be, I was really
Mhm.
struck by the stark contrast between the individual experiences that people shared of things that happened to them because of their gender, their skin color, their disabilities. And then when it came to solutions, it was very vague things like, we need to, dismantle structural racism. And like, what the hell does that mean? And as I was sitting there contemplating, how do you close that gap between, the sort of microscopic individual element behaviors to the more macroscopic system level behaviors? I was like, wait a second, this is what I've been doing at that point for the last 25 years. And so I thought
Sure.
maybe I can build an agent-based model that will simulate the happenings inside an organization to try to understand what factors impact people, and then to see if I can actually link that to the financial outcomes. And so I got super excited about it. I spent about a year talking to people, educating myself, doing research, and then built my first computer simulation, which has since grown. And that computer simulation was kind of the gateway to getting into this from a more commercial perspective. It's been really quite a door opener and getting companies excited about the
Mhm.
idea of managing DI in this quantitative way. And I should mention, interestingly, we can come back to this later, but I don't even, if you look through my website at alaria.tech, you will not see a mention of complexity science. You will not see a mention of agent-based simulation, even though
Great.
that's actually how I got into the field and how I got into doing the specific things that I'm doing. I'll be happy to, maybe that'll be a fun point to talk about a little bit later.
So a lot of the time that people look at like building a simulation of something, they're creating a version of the system and then they're testing like something that might change. So in the DI area, what are some of the things that organizations are considering changing that this simulation enables them to better understand or test out outcomes of?
Interestingly, right now, when I work with the majority of our clients, we don't use the simulations other than during the sales process. And
Yeah.
in the sales process, I have a video where I show a simulation of an organization with 4 layers, let's say entry-level management VPs and executives. And
Mhm.
initially starts with 50-50 men and women, and we could use any kind of diversity, but we do a very simple kind of binary gender
Sure.
representation. And what I show is that under most normal circumstances, the company can run for a very long time and it will stay 50-50 at all levels. But if you introduce a bias in promotions, meaning that the probability of being promoted is slightly higher if you're a man, what ends up happening is interesting because you end up getting, in a fairly short amount of time, you end up getting a company that is skewed very much like the way that you see in the real world, where you have mostly men at the top and then somewhat fewer men at the VP level and so on down the line. So you see exactly what you see in the real world. And in fact, I've written an academic paper with my colleague Chimin Zhang in which we showed that we could accurately match the gender imbalance in every industry in the United States. So when I do that, it just shows people that the importance of the connection between the microscopic behaviors
Yep.
and the macroscopic results that they get. And what ended up happening is that I was showing that simulation to the chief diversity officer of a huge company, and she's like, "Oh, I want to hire you. I want to customize this to my company. I'm going to give you all of my diversity data." And what I realized was, your diversity data is useless. It's not enough to know how many men, women, Black people, Hispanics, Latinx, whatever you have. I need to know what are their day-to-day experiences that influence both their satisfaction and therefore their productivity, their retention rates, et cetera. And
Sure.
so I embarked on it's like, how do we do that? So we came up with this idea of essentially asking people through this online platform that is completely confidential, what are specific experiences that you've had in the workplace that interfered with your ability to work? And then we categorize them. And initially, my idea was to take that data and put it into the computer simulation so that I could give a strategic planning tool, forecasting tool to the leaders. But what I
Sure.
realized is I'm building a space station for people that are still riding their bicycles down on Earth. And when people
Yep.
saw this new way of measuring experiences, which we think about it now as measuring inclusion, I realized that there was a huge gap in DI, which is that all that people measure is diversity, but diversity is an emergent outcome. So the fact that you have poor diversity doesn't tell you why you have poor diversity or how to fix it. And
Sure.
one of the things that I know is that just trying to fix an emergent outcome by manipulating it directly never really works very well. And so in the end, when I work with people right now, the only thing that I really do is to on the corporate side, we just simply use the simulation to motivate why we need to collect data about inclusion, and then we give them back the data. At some point in time, I'm hoping that we will get to a level of maturity in the company where after collecting the data, we'll also be able to put it back into the simulation and turn it into a strategic planning tool, but we haven't
Sure.
done that yet. So,
Sure.
so on the corporate side, it's been more helping me to understand what to do and helping me to explain to people. On the
Mhm.
nonprofit side, it's a little bit different where I have a number of projects where the simulation takes a much more central component because it's about explaining a particular problem.
Right. So a lot of times in the commercial setting, and I'm going to go off of something that you said they're describing, your customers, they were looking for something that was about like helping us solve diversity or helping us solve inclusion. And you mentioned that when you're trying to solve something that is truly an emergent phenomena and you're trying to just solve that one thing or like manipulate conditions around one thing, you're probably not going to get the results that you're aiming for. And I'm sure
Correct.
that was probably learned not only in this context, but in other contexts as well. Like
Yeah.
within the epistemic side, it might be, what's going to be the rate of adoption of this new pharmaceutical product that's coming into the market? Well, it's, if the only focus is on, we're just trying to get to peak sales quicker, well, like time to peak sales is like it's an outcome of this emergent system.
Yeah.
So, what were some of the other examples that you've learned this like don't just focus on this emergent outcome. Like you need to start going upstream and looking at like what is really driving it.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think that the world of DEI is absolutely replete with examples of people that try to fix the symptoms instead of the root causes. And I think part of that is because it is such a complex world. You're talking about human beings in a very, very complex ecosystem. And so, of course, the emergent phenomena depend in a very, very intricate and indirect way on everything that you're doing. And I think, the most classical example is the fact that, and I've been a very vocal I don't want to say it's not that I criticize DEI, but I've written articles starting as far back as 2018 in which I said if we continue to focus just on recruiting diverse talent and if we continue to focus on diversity as a target, it's going to lead to backlash. And I wrote an article in Forbes in 2018, in April of 2018, long before there was a big explosion of DI and then long before there was a backlash. And so one of the things that I tell people is I use this analogy. I say, look, if you walk into a house in the winter and it feels cold, you look at the thermostat, it says 50 degrees. I know how to fix it. I'm going to light a match under the thermostat. And look, now it reads 60 degrees, 70 degrees, 80 degrees. But meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is open, the roof is leaking, and you may burn the house down. And so when you try to fix diversity by increasing the diversity of incoming employees primarily, you're shooting yourself in the foot because in the end, what you're actually doing is you're pissing off people who do not come from diverse backgrounds, and you're bringing more people into an environment that is really not designed for them. Because clearly, if you don't have a lot of diversity, it's not because somebody says, oh, no, we want 80% white people. It's because some of the conditions in the workplace make it more difficult for women, people with disabilities, people of color to succeed. And you see that in the retention rates. And so
Mhm.
what I tell people is that it's like you have a leaky bucket. In fact, there's a ton of data that shows that the level of diversity in company decreases systematically when you go from entry level to executive level. At the entry level, you look in retail and you have majority women. You have more than 60% entry level positions are women. By the time you get to the executive level, you have something like 70% men. And so that was one example that is just a very canonical example. And people still today, in spite of the backlash, hang on to that idea of, oh, we need to focus on hiring, we need to focus on hiring. But another example that I see that I get into amazing conversations with people, you probably heard people talk about pay gap, the fact that women get paid 80 cents on the dollar and all these things. And the way that people go about it, it's like you're trying to fix the pay gap. You're trying to find disparities and then, oh, let's just pay women in this role more than we were paying them before. Well, you're not fixing the problem, you're fixing the symptoms. And until you actually understand the root causes, until you actually understand why this is happening, you're not going to solve the problem, and you're probably going to piss people off in the process, right? So
Sure.
I would say, in my experience, I've always seen that people come in, whether they're, real deep experts in an industry, or whether it's more like an entire approach to things like diversity and inclusion. People tend to build their mental models, and they tend to think very linear, simple connections. Oh, I don't have enough black people, I'm going to hire more black people. I don't have enough money, whatever, and so that's something that is, yeah, it's a big problem. And simulations are so useful that way. Being able to actually show, here are your assumptions. Here is a simulation, looks like a little game. Does this look like what you're familiar with? Yes. Okay, well, here is what the simulation shows, which is
Mhm.
different from what you thought would show, but here is why. And we said so many examples of executives that came in saying, oh, your simulation is wrong. And then when we dig in, they're like, oh, oops, maybe you're right. So it's kind of fun
Mhm.
to do that. I like them, like I like to call them debunking conventional wisdom.
Sure. Well, within this kind of like debunking conventional wisdom kind of frame, we find it is very common that this type of thinking is like one, it's not proliferated across many organizations. There might be a few people that try to think this way. It takes a high level of probably like self-awareness to understand, like, you know what, like I don't actually know how this thing goes because I've tried to look at something in a linear way many times before and it just doesn't play out. So it sounds like one of the things that you've done to help encourage this type of thinking with others is, there's some videos that you've put together about like showing emergent effects. There's working with those execs to enable them to say, all right, well, like if I'm going to change these things, now the model's right. Now let's go see how it plays out. Oh, interesting that it didn't play out how I thought it was going to. What are what are some of the other ways that you've found over time, whether it was your work with Eric or with any of your other clients, that helps people start thinking about emergent systems, or this kind of, you don't use complexity, you don't use edge-based modeling. We're aiming not to do that either. But how do you start helping people think this way? Because that's really the big unlock.
Yeah. No, and it's you're absolutely right. I think that people do not realize how, we've been doing statistics for a couple hundred years now, and people are so used to thinking in terms of things like convergence properties and accuracy, and those ideas are really profoundly flawed in the sense that they reflect a reality that is bounded by our ability to address problems of a certain complexity. And so we continue to hang on to that. And I sometimes, when I talk to clients, I will get into details about things like emergent behaviors. And by the way, I've been teaching for years. So when I left academia, I was actually a tenured professor at Boston University. I left in 2000. But then after that, a few years later, I started to teach a course at Tufts University, and then I've taught at City College of New York, and then I've taught at NYU. And I teach a course on what I call, I've had a few titles, but the most recent one has been How to Manage Complexity in Business and Society. And there, I always start by talking about the difference between, and I've developed my own jargon, which is a little bit different from what I hear in a lot of the more academic approaches to agent-based simulation. I talk about the difference between, structural elements of a system and the emergent properties of a system. And I give examples, starting with very simple things like I love the single lane traffic simulation in NetLogo because it
Sure.
just brings to life the fact that, holy cow, like with the stupidest set of assumptions, I can actually get something that looks very realistic. I talk about how, if some of the profound differences between agent-based modeling, where you can start with very simple pieces and keep building on. And unlike statistical models where you have to like keep making different assumptions and basically recalibrate models, et cetera, with an agent-based model, you can continue to expand kind of the details and the capabilities based on what you need to answer, and you're not breaking what you've already proven to be accurate. So all of that, I sometimes use it, but honestly, when it comes to convincing leaders, I found that more often than not, it's more about seeing proof that the approach has worked with other situations that were similar to theirs. And
Hmm.
only then will they open up to the idea of understanding the different concepts. And I think it's I mean, look, most clients that I've seen, think about sometimes I remember when we were working in ecosystem, people would say, wow, what you do is so radically different from everybody. Do you have any competitors? And it was like, well, my problem is that a lot of my competitors are people that use statistical analysis or that use other approaches. Because from the point of
Sure.
view of the client, they don't care. They just want to know, solve my problem for me. And I can tell you many clients that we worked with where we explained to them the methodology, but at the end of the day, all they really cared about was, oh, wow, this is really cool because it works for me.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a, I find that I think about problems in a radically different way than most human beings because I've literally been doing this for 40 years now. Well,
Sure.
35 years. I mean, since I started my PhD or my master's degree. So yeah, actually about 40 years because it was 1984, 85 when I started to work on my master's, right? And so I think about things in a radically different way. And when I teach that, in fact, there's a side of me, I've had people that have taken my courses that have said, my God, this material should be taught in every department of every university because it really shows you a radically different way of thinking about problems and that notion of the disconnect between sort of like structural elements of the problem and the emergent behaviors is a profound concept that most people are really unfamiliar with. But once you explain it to them, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many problems that like can get rewired and how you solve it. And to your point, like a customer, their customer or a person trying to figure something out, they're looking for a solution to a challenge, not a technology or not a, you know, some gadget or whatever it might be. They're looking for the solve of that pain point that they're trying to mitigate or
Yes.
have go away. So that
Yes.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Um, so you're teaching some of these concepts. Where else have you seen people get interested in complex systems, complexity science, or even agent-based modeling? And if people want to get into this more specifically, if kids are in high school or college, like listening to this podcast, like where else do you think they should go for more information?
It's a good question. I've not done as good of a job of keeping up with sort of the broader field of complexity science. I have to say, I mean, I subscribe to a few newsletters. I keep tabs, the Santa Fe Institute's Parallax or whatever they call their newsletter and a few other things. But, New England Complexity Science Institute, NEXI. But I find that, frankly, a lot of the work is very academic. It's about proving things and looking at theoretical aspects, which it's really not my thing. I've always been a very applied. I would much prefer, and we've done computer simulations. Like when I was working with Eric at Ecosystem, we at one point we worked for the Navy. We did a simulation where we literally simulated the entire Navy, like all of their sailors, for
Wow.
like 2 decades to do
Wow.
long-term planning. And we could run that on a laptop. We could run a full-blown simulation. Back then it was like in 20 minutes or 10 minutes, which was unheard of, right? And now we could
Wow.
probably run it in 5 seconds. But and it was really, I would say, for people that want to learn, I would recommend my number one recommendation would be download NetLogo, go to the Northwest University NetLogo website and just play with it. Play with it, and then go to the community. The name is slipping, but they have the community website where people submit their own models, etc. And just poke around. Just start out by looking at the staggering variety of problems that people work on, because that's one of the things that people I think fail to appreciate is that these days nobody would blink an eye if you suggested using statistics for virtually every function in a business, whether it's marketing, people analytics, product design, stocking your shelves, whatever. I mean, all of that, people statistics are used to the fact that that's just a technique. What a lot of people don't realize is that statistics was created. The reason why it's called statistics, the root of the word comes from stata, because, state, because it was heads of state that didn't have computers. They needed to figure out with paper and pencil what their population was doing. And
Hmm.
so mathematicians came up with simplifications, with abstractions. But by definition, those abstractions are hiding all the details. That's kind of the whole point of statistics. You want to hide the details so you can come up with some quantity of doing that. As we've evolved computers, there has been a very interesting phenomenon, which is that people have come up with increasingly sophisticated ways of using statistics on larger and larger data sets. What we're doing is radically different. It's like we are using the power of the computer so that instead of throwing away the details, we save the details. We literally
Right.
simulate individuals, and we can do massive scale simulations where we now can calculate the same statistics at the macroscopic level while preserving all the details of the individual so that we can connect those two and understand the link. Learning to simulate net logo to me is profoundly important because it teaches you in a very practical way that link and the fact that that link is very often completely non-obvious. And then from there, you can choose. Are you more interested in the theoretical aspects of the of agent-based simulation, in which I would definitely say, I mean, first of all, there is the book by there's the and I cannot believe Bill Rand and I want to say Smolensky, but that was my neural networks background. I apologize. I cannot believe I'm blanking on his name.
With Yuri.
Yuri Bolensky, yes. And their book is great. I have to say, I've looked at a number of books on agent-based models. Again, a lot of them end up falling into what I think are more kind of theoretical aspects and very simple examples. I've been working for years on a book that I've not yet had the time to actually finish writing, but when that comes out, I hope it'll be more practical, hands-on, reaching a really wide audience that's not just academic. But yeah, NetLogo, Santa Fe Institute, Nexi, look at, Northwestern University simulation, the whole page there. Those are all very good places to start.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing with measuring inclusion for a bit. And then, there's probably two other questions that I like to ask everybody who's on the show or on the podcast. When Yeah. So like, when thinking about measuring inclusion, like what were some of the common challenges that came up when looking at organizations? Because measuring diversity, they're just doing that in kind of a stats-based way, but inclusion,
Yeah.
how did you have to come up with a definition of inclusion that fit within these different orgs?
Yeah. Well, so one of the big challenges that I saw in the field of DI, which I think is actually it hasn't caused the problems, but I think it is something that has made it possible for people who are against DI to attack it as viciously as they have, is that a lot of the definitions were not sufficiently clear cut and quantifiable. So if you ask 10 people in DI how to define inclusion, you're going to get 10 different answers.
Right.
Equity, there's a different story with equity, but that was also another area where the definitions were kind of vague. I basically came at it completely backwards. And again, if you were to read my book, I think that you would recognize the thread very clearly of going from the individual through the ecosystem to the emergent, right? And what I talk about is the fact that ultimately diversity is emergent. I bring an analogy with financial management. I say, look, diversity in a company, if you think of your human assets and you compare them to your financial assets, diversity is like your balance sheet. It's a snapshot in time of your portfolio of assets, and which depends on everything that happened before, but it doesn't tell you about how you got there. Now,
Sure.
imagine being a CFO and only having the balance sheet to run your company. You would fail miserably. What do you need? Well, you need cash flow and you need P&L. And the cash flow and P&L tell you two very different things. Cash flow tells you about all of the things that are increasing and decreasing your cash through, sales and expenses on a moment by moment basis. Whereas P&L looks at across different parts of the organization, different processes, different divisions, different departments, and it tells you which ones are profitable and which ones are actually losing. Well, when I developed this idea of measuring inclusion, what I realized that that's like cash flow in the sense that we literally measure the day-to-day experiences that
Mhm.
impact people, impact their
Sure.
satisfaction. And it's a very, very well-known fact that if your satisfaction is higher, you produce more and you're more likely to stay. And so we can link that to finances. And so we see what we call measuring inclusion, which is literally measuring and categorizing individual experiences as being like the cash flow. And then the next level, which I was kind of calling it measuring equity, and now honestly I'm calling it measure merit, because meritocracy is another one of these terms that's very poorly understood and very often abused. But
Hmm.
essentially, if you look at promotions, project assignments, compensation, bonuses, whatever perks you get, all of those things that happen on a longer time scale, if you see imbalances, if you see, for example, that certain groups of people are much more likely to get promoted than other groups of people, then you know that it's like a loss in your P&L. It means that there's something going on with your promotion scheme, and you need to look at it. So there's very neat parallel between, again, the measure inclusion is the way that I define it is at the microscopic level, what happens to individuals. Measuring merit is about, are the processes, the policies, the resources in my organization designed to give all employees the same opportunity to succeed? And then diversity is like your thermometer, your thermostat. It's like, overall, do we see that there is something fishy going on here? If so, let's look down at all of our processes. And if we see that there are some imbalances, let's look at the inclusion data to tell us what exactly is happening and how we can fix the problems.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. So one of two final questions to get into the podcast. So every time that we have people on, I like to ask about a what the flux moment. And we describe a what the flux moment as something where if you could go back in time, you know how it played out, and you're like, that was ridiculous. Let's rewind. We're going to do a whole set of things differently. What would be, whether personal life, career wise, moment in history, uh, what's one of your kind of what the flux moments that you'd want to see a different emergent outcome from?
Well, I would say, I mean, I could think of probably a lot of them. I think that in terms of specific decisions that relate to the work that I'm doing right now, I came into the space kind of with the wrong idea. I came into it thinking that initially from a gender lens and thinking, oh, this is something that there are there's evidence that women and men bring somewhat complementary skills to the workforce. And so if I could build a simulation that shows that having a broader, so it was a little bit like, Scott Page, right? You probably know the work of Scott Page, who's also come
Yep.
at diversity, equity, and inclusion from really diversity from a complexity science argument. I think he looks at it more from the value of diversity intrinsically. I looked at it in a slightly different way, but initially I thought of it in a very similar way. And then what I realized very quickly is that was actually a big mistake, because it sort of left a big question. It's like, well, if you may argue that overall, statistically speaking, there are some differences between men and women, but how do you justify all the other groups that are clearly not having the same kinds of opportunities? And so that was for me, just on the personal level, it was a very big realization, realizing that, hey, this is something that can actually have an impact on a pretty broad part of society, but I need to expand my thinking. I need to think about how, it's a different way to do it. And then, more generally, I mean, I've changed careers. I started out my career as a professor. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Then I fell in love with everything mechanical and I wanted to be an auto mechanic designer. Then I fell in love with computers. Then I fell in love with the brain. Then I became a professor, and then I was like, forget academia. I don't want to be in academia. I want to be an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I'm one of these people that whenever I see something that either really excites me or that really surprises me, I am very comfortable making 90-degree turns and going off in a different direction. Lots of flux, lots of what the flux moments like that.
There you go. There you go. So, one of the goals of getting this group of people who've been on the podcast together is to help amplify, the work that everyone else is doing. So, if you had to point out like one or two things that you think would make agent-based modeling become more of a mainstream, uh, kind of just data science practice in more companies, like machine learning, like the use of large language models, what would it be, or what would it take for agent-based modeling to elevate up to those levels?
I think there's an aspect of agent-based modeling that is completely underappreciated. And I think it's also, I don't know that I've heard anybody ever talk about it other than me teaching in my class. I jokingly talk about what I call the big data little brain problem, right? So when people talk about data-driven modeling, in 99% of the cases, you basically take a bunch of data, you throw it over the wall to a data scientist who applies whatever, k-means or whatever clustering, whatever, machine learning algorithms. They extract some patterns that seem interesting to them. And these people probably have zero knowledge of your domain of expertise, and then just throw the data back at you. And then it's up to you to use your expertise to solve the problem. What does that mean? That means that you're going purely data driven and you're completely ignoring the value of the very people that are doing the work of the domain experts. In
Sure.
an agent-based model, you have to bring in both. You have to have the domain expertise, and you have to have the simulation and modeling chops to be able to take that domain expertise and turn it into a model, which to me means very clearly that when you're not using an agent-based model, you're literally using an impoverished model. It's like I'm throwing away half of my data. In this case, I'm throwing away and abdicating my knowledge as a domain expert. And with an agent-based model, you're forced to bring that back in. I think that that's a very compelling argument because it
Mhm.
shows that it's an incremental value. It's still very data driven. Of course, there's a whole issue of, how to use the data, how do you calibrate, and I have a whole bunch of answers to that as well. But this in particular is something that perks up a lot of people, because when they understand that, hey, I'm going to see my own domain expertise in your model. I'm going to see how my mental model of how the world works is actually
Right.
implemented and how it's reflected in simulation. And it's very intuitive. I don't have to have a degree in mathematics or in data science. I can look at it and say, oh, well, these consumers are going to the supermarket too often. Let's change that, let's make them go less than, whatever. It's, to me, that's kind of mind blowing. And it really opens up a lot of interest in at least saying, oh, okay, maybe this is something worth looking at.
Awesome. Well, Paul, so glad to have had you on the podcast. There's plenty of other things we got to chat about. So we're going to get to that. And again, thanks for being on.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.